It's time to talk about Las Vegas with Ira. Each week, Ira David Sternberg talks with the celebrities, entertainers, writers, and personalities who make Las Vegas the most exciting city in the world. And now, here's Ira.
Anything you want us to be, bring us your fantasy, LV.
My guest is Cary Fisher, president and co-owner of Fisher Spacepen Company, the iconic American family business based in Boulder City, right next to Las Vegas. The company was founded by his father, Paul C. Fisher, inventor of the original AG-7 anti-gravity pen, the one first used by American astronauts on Apollo 7 in 1968. For everything about the Fisher Spacepen Company, go to spacepen.com. And Cary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. Pleased to be here.
Fascinating story. So before we even get to your background, which is also interesting, let's talk about your dad, since he got this whole ball rolling. And apropos of him, so much has gone on over the decades that I think we'll clearly talk about during our conversation. But would you consider your dad a visionary in the sense that he was the inventor? So we talked about the anti-gravity pen, but just the fact that he looked at ballpoint pens and realized that something could be done with them that would allow it to be used in space?
He really wasn't focused on that. He was one of the pioneers in the pen business. He started out as a vendor to the company that introduced the ballpoint pen in the United States, about 1946, I believe it was. And he wasn't too impressed with it at that time. The solvents were very low surface tension, oleic acid based. So they'd run out the tip, they'd run out the back. You could transfer a signature with your thumbprint a week after somebody had written it. So
not very forgers.
The ink would dry up in 6 months or so. So there's just a lot of problems with him. And when he first looked at it, he just said, "Oh, this is a faulty concept. It's no good. It'll never be any good. I don't want anything to do with it." But he couldn't turn down the screw machine job shop business. So he took some of that, and he basically helped his best friend set up their first production line in the United States. He finally became a believer. By the time Milton Reynolds went out of the pen business a few years later, he went to Mr. Reynolds and says, "Well, if you're not going to be in a pen business anymore, do you mind if I get in? Because I think I can do something with it." And he said, "Sure, why not?" So it's no skin off my nose. And so he started tried to make a better pen. And he tried to pressurize pens from very early on. So
now, the idea behind pressurization is what specifically? To keep the ink from leaking or to allow it to perform other tasks?
Well, one of the big problems is it would back leak. If you wrote upside down with a pen, you'd break that straw, like this. When you pick up a straw with your fingertip on it, you hold the liquid, you pick up your finger, it all runs out. Well, if you wrote upside down with a regular pen, all that ink would start running out the back if you kept it upside down. So that and the drying out. He said, "Oh boy, if I sealed it up and pressurized it, then it couldn't dry out, could it? Right. It couldn't run out the back. So now all I got to do is worry about running out the front."
Which you want it to run out in order to write.
But you want it to run out when you want it to run out.
Yes, right.
Not on its own. So he did thousands of experiments. He'd make an ink and a point combination, and he'd leave it on his desk pressurized from our compressors. And he'd come back the next morning, and sure enough, he'd have a puddle of ink on his blotter. So it didn't work too well. But he kept at it. And then in the early 60s, his dad came to him in a dream, because he'd been deceased. He says, "If you put rosin in the ink, you can solve your problems."
Interesting.
So he went to his chemist. His chemist, by the way, we hired and we paid him for a year before we had anything we could use from him.
But you had he had faith in the chemist, though. At some point, something would break through.
So anyway, there's not that many rosins, I guess. 5 or 6 commercially available. So he tried them all, and none of that worked. But he got thinking, Well, Paul and his dad wouldn't know the difference between rosin and resin. So let me try some resins. So he found a synthetic rubber from B.F. Goodrich that actually worked pretty well. We first put it in our pens, our gravity pens, and what it did is you used to get a buildup. When you wrote with a pen, some of the ink would pile up on the tip of the point. It wouldn't all get sucked back into the socket. And then eventually you'd get enough on there, you'd get a little blob on your paper unless you continually wiped it off. By putting that a little bit of rubber in the ink, it made it self-cohesive. So the ink wanted to stay together, so it would kind of suck it back in to the rest of the end of the socket instead of building up on the outside. And the side benefit was it added to the wear life of the refills. So my dad ran against John Kennedy in the 1968 New Hampshire primary. After President Kennedy got elected, he called my dad and asked him to help fix the post office pens because they were terrible. The specs only talked about the size and shape of the pen. I didn't talk at all about how they wrote, how long they would last, the quality of the writing, any of that. So my dad went to Washington and helped him write specs, which we could meet. Because of that rubber we put in ink, it turned out nobody else could pass the specs. So for I don't know, 3 or 4 years, we had all the post office.
Right. They call it a monopoly, Cary, I believe, for that period of time.
Yeah, accidental monopoly. But
yeah, accidental, right.
Eventually, he kind of let the cat out of the bag, and we had. He was a very nice competitor. We had a company, Anja Pen Company, who was trying to build. I think they assigned it to the Indians to make the post office pens. So the Indians were trying to get the refills from Anja, and they were having trouble because when you add that rubber to the ink, well, now it was starving, it was feeding out because the ink's a little thicker, a little more adhesive, and so my dad just told him, you just got to make your breakthrough hole bigger, so there's a bigger tube to feed the ink into the point.
Right.
And that solved the problem, and we lost the post office business. So,
but you went from post office to space. Now, how did that happen? Where all of a sudden now you have the Fisher Space Pen, which is the whole story which you're going to talk about because we have the time, and it's fascinating.
My dad being the kind of guy he was, if a little is good, a lot would be better.
Yes,
so
I agree.
He said, well, let's try putting a lot of ink in this thing and then pressurizing it. And that's a lot of rubber in it.
Right.
And so that's basically what we did. It still took thousands of experiments. But eventually we got a breakthrough. He started out with a pen that had a little pump on the back of it. So when you extended the point, it pressurized it. It would write about a page, maybe 2 pages. And then you'd have to retract it and repump it to keep it pressurized. But it didn't take him but a year from that time to figure out how to permanently pressurize it. Of course, we went through our mistakes. Remember we started with a nylon plug in the back because it's self-sealing, self-healing material. The problem is air will pass through nylon slowly over time. So it worked great leaving the factory, but a year later, there was no pressure left.
Right.
So we ended up having to use a brass plug.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. So once he had that deal with the post office and he realized he can figure things out, how did the decision to create a pen for space come about? In other words, was it requested by NASA, or he decided he was going to create the pen that then NASA would use?
He was still just trying to make a better pen. Now, in hindsight, he kind of changed the story a little bit. He said, I got thinking about the astronauts, because it's more interesting that way.
Of course.
But the reality was he was just trying to make a better pen. And by doing that, by pressurizing and sealing it, you stop the back leaking, you stop the drying out. Because of the rubber system, the system we were using, and the quality of points we had to make to that, it stopped the oozing out the front. And an additional factor, it would write in freezing cold, and of course upside down, or in what they call now, not zero gravity, microgravity. That's what we call it
These days
in space. Yeah. And so he got it, and he says, yeah, well, and Kennedy put this challenge up to put a man on the moon, and he's going, hey, well, these guys are going to need a pen just like this. So he got in the congressional record. You know, he called everybody he could think of. He tried NASA, didn't get anywhere. And then they had an accident, I think it was Apollo 1, where they burned on the launch pad. And that basically, NASA then said, okay, we got to relook at all this. They were using a pure oxygen atmosphere at that time. So everything was saturated with oxygen. So when a fire started, it just burnt like you poured gasoline on it. So, because the oxidizer was already immersed in the materials. So they banned everything they could that would burn in the cartridge. So grease pencils, all that kind of stuff went out the window.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So they called around and, they asked Papermate and Parker and Scripto. Those were the really big names at the time.
I've got a name for you, which you may not remember, but I'll throw it out there. Lindy.
Lindy Pen Company, sure. Yeah. Actually, at one time, Fisher and Lindy were the two biggest stick pen manufacturers in the country until Bic came along, and then Papermate became more of a marketing company, I guess, at least at that end. So it's bad. I lost my train of thought a little bit here.
That's okay. Didn't mean to have you lose it, but I just wanted to bring up that pen company. The government called around to come up.
They called around
right.
Those 3 or 4 companies, and they didn't get anywhere. And they were talking to Ed Malugin at Dallas Pen, who's a pen wholesaler, and he says, "Well, you should try Paul Fisher. He does more research than anybody, as far as I know." And so they did. And of course, my dad's reaction was, "Where you been? I've been trying to get a hold of you." We submitted samples, and they put them to. So they didn't spend any money on developing the pen. They might have spent $1 million testing it. I'm not sure about that, but quite a bit. And after about a year of testing, they decided it was good to go, and it was been on every. Well, that was the first Apollo mission that burned. The first manned Apollo mission was Apollo 7.
Right.
And we've been on that one and every one since. Got about 50 of them up in the National Space Station today. International Space Station, excuse me. For years, based on a suggestion from Sergeant Shriver, my dad had given space pens to the Russians, so they used our pens as well. May not admit it, but we know they did. We met some of the cosmonauts,
and they will tell you that. But what was your dad's reaction to the fact that they finally made it to space? That the pens made it to space? Was he excited? Was he happy? Was it just he expected it, or what was his? Do you know? What his reaction was?
He was ecstatic. He tried to give them to the government for free. He would have been happy to just give it just for the pride of the space.
Sure. All right.
But of course, that was against government regulations.
They had to pay him.
So they had to pay him. So we gave him the best discount we would have given any wholesaler.
Right. Right. And what's fascinating to me, and that's why I wanted to sit down with you, is that it's been over 50 years, and everybody knows about the Fisher Space Pen.
Hardly.
A lot of people still do. Yeah. In other words, it started in space, but it has been going strong ever since. And you're as I mentioned in the intro, you're here in Boulder City, right outside of Las Vegas. People use the product globally, and it's just fascinating to me that a product has sustained itself over that. Now, clearly, there's other products that your company makes, other kinds of pens, but still, the fact that it still has that lineage, I guess, is the part that fascinates me.
Yes, well, and once they started using the space, it wasn't the anti-gravity pen anymore. It was the space pen.
Right.
And that's how we changed the name. So,
and you originally, as a company, started out in California, but then you moved to Boulder City.
Actually, we started out in 1948 as a division of his Screw Machine Job Shop.
Correct. That's right. That's where he started out.
Chicago,
Your dad, Paul Fisher.
Yeah, in Chicago, Illinois. He moved a research facility to California after he got married the second time, because his wife, they honeymooned there, and his wife said, "I'd love to live here." And he said, "Well, if you can find a house to live in the 2 days we have left that we can afford, okay."
And
well,
she did,
found
right?
a guy that was going to Europe for a year and just wanted somebody to watch his house.
Perfect.
Perfect deal, right?
Yeah.
So
and he got a pen out of it,
so
too.
he was trapped. So he opened up the research facility. Eventually, we opened up a sales office and did all that. But so we ended up in California, and we were doing all what I call the hard stuff. We were making the points. Eventually, we were making the inks out there, particularly pressurized inks, and assembling all the space pens. Our stick pen business was still, and gravity refill business was still in Illinois, and our major sales office was there.
Well, let's take a break.
Okay.
My guest is Cary Fisher. He's president and co-owner of Fisher Space Pen Company, the iconic American family business based here in Boulder City, right next to Las Vegas. The company was founded by his father, Paul C. Fisher, inventor of the original AG-7 anti-gravity pen, now called the Space Pen. It's the one used by American astronauts on Apollo 7 in 1968. For everything about the Fisher Space Pen Company, go to spacepen.com. We'll be right back.
We'll be back with more Talk About Las Vegas with Ira in just a moment.
You've seen mobsters and cops face off on the big screen. You've heard the legends of Al Capone and Elliot Ness. But how much do you know about what really happened? Dive into the true stories behind the myths of organized crime and law enforcement at the Mob Museum, the country's finest collection of mob artifacts, history, and interactive exhibits. Find out more and get tickets at themobmuseum.org.
Now let's get back to Talk About Las Vegas with Ira.
Welcome back. I'm talking with Cary Fisher, president and co-owner of Fisher Space Pen Company, the iconic American family business based in Boulder City, right next to Las Vegas. The company was founded by his father, Paul C. Fisher. He's inventor of the original AG-7 anti-gravity pen, the one first used by American astronauts on Apollo 7 in 1968, now called the Space Pen. For everything about the Fisher Space Pen Company, go to spacepen.com. And Cary, you are now the president, as I mentioned. There's a co-owner as well.
Yes.
Doc. Tell us a little bit about Doc.
Doc Wong is a very interesting guy. Most accurate man I've ever met. If you want anything proofread, we can have 5 people upstairs proofread a new catalog. Send it down to Doc, and he'll find 20 mistakes in it. So just fabulous that way. But he started at 17. He was just going to take a summer job. He was working for our plant manager, and he was also our quality assurance manager at the time. And he just put Doc to work kept him interested. And he just never ended up going back to school. So he's been here all these years, and because of some estate planning and family politics, he ended up with half the business from my dad.
But you guys work together well.
Oh yeah, it's been a great partnership.
Yeah.
I believe he knows he can trust me, and I certainly trust him.
Right.
And there's nobody more technically knowledgeable about the pen business, particularly our pen business, than Doc. So
We talked about moving to California, and then what was the decision to move to Boulder City?
Well, my dad went through ended his third marriage, and he was pretty fed up with.
So he's going through pens and wives.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
My dad had a great ego. More than once he told me he may be the smartest man in his generation, which drove my mother, who was his first wife, absolutely nuts. Actually, that's kind of how he ended up running for president. I'm kind of getting sidetracked here from your question.
Right.
But he was failing at his business. I think part of that may have been my mother didn't appreciate his ego, and so she was maybe a little hard on it. And so his self-confidence might have suffered a little bit. But the business was not doing well. He was failing. And he said, I'm going to close the doors, I'm going to go, and I'm going to think. He didn't close the doors, but he left for a couple of weeks. He went to the Ozarks with all of us, and he just...
Is that where you go to think?
That's where he went to think.
Okay.
And
not everybody goes to the Ozarks to think. Some go up to mountaintops.
It was
in
it was
Malibu
a cabin in the Ozarks.
Okay,
So it was
fair enough.
out of the way. And he ended up writing 12 rules.
12 rules.
Well, I'm not sure it started out at 12. I think he started at 8. And then as he came up to something that he didn't want to follow his rule, he might amend it. And he also found situations where he needed to add a rule. But he did that, and he started following those 12 rules in his business. And overnight, he became a success.
Do you remember any of the rules? Can you give us one or two?
Always tell the truth was a big one. Be completely accurate.
Did he amend the first one at all occasionally?
I think there's some...
For purposes of publicity or other reasons?
No, I think he may have said... well, one of his rules was, you can tell the truth, nothing but the truth, but you don't have to tell the whole truth. So I saw people try to put words in his mouth to confirm what he's had said, the way they were interpreting it, and he would just kind of go into his deaf act. So so he wasn't going to hang himself, in other words. So he had a right to keep his mouth shut. That's basically what it came down. So he would, if he opened his mouth, he was going to tell you the truth. And that was probably a really big rule. And
but those are
good. I can't recite them now. But
no, that's fine. I like the fact that you at least remembered one or two.
Yeah.
So the decision to move from California to Boulder City was made by your dad and others, or?
Well, my dad was a sole proprietorship. He could do exactly what he wanted to do. And he wanted to get away from the California taxes, and he wanted a place that had an international airport, because he was still flying back to Chicago at least once a month, as well as we wanted to be able to ship efficiently. We had international customers by then. I actually brought a friend home from school whose father was running the BLM at the time, Richard West. Harley West was running the BLM. Richard West was my friend. I brought him home for dinner one night, and we're talking about it. And he says, well, why don't you look at Henderson? They're really pro-business, and, we have low tax base here, and we got an airport. We just got everything you want. So my dad came up and contacted the Nevada Development Authority, and they showed him properties. And this one happened to be vacant, and the Boulder City had given the company that acquired the property a big tax incentives and all that, and they were going to and gave them the land, I guess, or at very low cost. They had if they didn't create the jobs, they had a right to take the land back. So of course now they put this big building up, that would be a big loss. So Boulder City basically said, you work out something with this man and get us some workers back in town, or we're going to take your land back. And so it worked out. We had kind of a crushing lease payment for a while until my dad got an SBA loan, and we converted it into our own property.
And you are a small business in a way, although you're global. Tell us a little bit about now. And part of the reason I wanted to talk to you was, well, recently there was the 50th anniversary, but also too, you went to the White House for a ceremony, and it was because you produce a product in America, and you're a small business, and you're representing Nevada. So tell us a little bit about that experience and what that was like.
It was pretty neat. I'd been to Washington a few times. First time was with my father over the post office business.
Did you wear a tie for that White House visit?
I did wear a tie. That's right. I was debating on whether I should get one of those space-themed ones,
right?
Power tie. But, I think I gave the power tie to my son, and I wore the space-themed one. But we had a bunch of people come through. We had the controller of the currency who signed a dollar bill for me, and
With a Fisher spaceman?
actually, she did use our pen. That's right. And Wilbur Ross came through. Ben Carson came through. Mike Pence came through. Apparently, Donald Trump had come through the night before when everybody set up. Unfortunately,
The exhibits, in other words, right.
Unfortunately, we looked at it and says, well, we can set up in a half an hour. We'll just do it the morning of the event. So we didn't fly in until Sunday night. So Monday morning we set up, but he didn't see it. So unfortunately, it's not one of the products he picked to talk about in his speech. But I think if we'd been there, so that was a tactical error on our part. But
Happens.
yeah.
Also, too, the Museum of Modern Art, their permanent collection, they have the pen there as well.
That's right. It was selected for their permanent collection as an example of elegant industrial design. That's the New York Museum of Modern
Right.
Art. Yes.
Yeah, I should have said specifically.
I don't think you'll find it displayed currently, but it's in their permanent collection.
Right.
So if they cycle that kind of exhibit back out and make it back out.
That's great. Looking forward, and we have just a few minutes left, looking forward, what do you see the future of the company? You obviously, as I mentioned earlier, diversify. You're not just making the space pen, you're making other pens with the same, clearly the same, anti-gravity properties.
Yes.
But it's not all the bullet pen, so the bullet shape pen, it's regular shape pens
that
as well.
bullet shape pen is interesting. Just as a quick aside, assuming we've got time, my dad designed that pen in 1948. It's still our best seller, and that's the one that's in the Museum of Modern Art. But of course, we make retractables, we make keychain pens and things with carabiners.
But the original one is your best seller still.
Yes, amazing. And of course, we do it now in about 10 different finishes. So, so we've got reds and black, of course, and titanium, gold titanium nitride and black titanium nitride,
Right.
a rainbow titanium. And so,
Well, was there an evolutionary decision, not revolutionary, but evolutionary decision over a period of time to diversify in terms of the look of the finish and the different kinds of shapes of pens that you deal with now? Or was it something that you just decided at some point, from now on, we're not just doing the space pen, we're also doing A, B, and C?
well, we call them all space pens, and they're just filling consumer niches for people who want something a little different.
Yeah, so to differentiate the bullet pen versus the other space pens. Let's put it that way, right? In other words,
well, we had to make a retractable pen with an all-metal mechanism for NASA. So we had retractable pens. Before that, we made a lot of stick pens, but they were all gravity pens. And eventually we got out of that business by choice. We want to make something that we make better than anybody else. And so we pretty much only make pressurized ballpoint pens. We make them for different applications, like we sell them for high-speed drafting machines, the log house industry uses them. It's not very big volume, but they find it very useful to write on logs for some reason. I'm not quite sure why.
you got me.
But they have to mark the logs before they cut them and stuff like that. And, as far as where the future goes, I think most people would say, well, in 20 years, and they probably said that 20 years ago, we won't be using pens anymore because they said we wouldn't be using paper by then.
Correct.
But the reality is you probably always want to have a writing instrument or a marking instrument for something. And because we've had pens that come back that are over 30 years old, it's still right. You're not going to get another technology type of pen that's exposed to the atmosphere, the ink is exposed to the atmosphere, that's going to happen. So if you got a pen that's sitting in your glove compartment or in your desk that you're only going to pull out once every 6 months, it's kind of frustrating if the second time you want to use it, it's all dried up already. Don't have that problem with our pen.
Great way to end it. I appreciate it. My guest has been Cary Fisher, president and co-owner of Fisher Space Pen Company, the iconic American family business based in Boulder City, right next to Las Vegas. The company was founded by his father, Paul C. Fisher, inventor of the original AG-7 anti-gravity pen, the one first used by American astronauts on Apollo 7 in 1968. For everything about the Fisher Space Pen Company, go to spacepen.com. LasVegas.com. And Cary, thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
See you next time.
Okay.
You've been listening to Talk About Las Vegas with Ira. Each week, Ira David Sternberg talks with the celebrities, entertainers, writers, and personalities who make Las Vegas the most exciting city in the world.
Anything you want us to